Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This is PA Books, featuring authors of books about Pennsylvania's people, politics, history, business, and recreation. This week, co-authors Craig Horrell and Joseph Foster discuss their book, Lawmaking and Legislators in Pennsylvania, a biographical dictionary.
Craig Horley, author and editor of Lawmaking and Legislators in Pennsylvania, 1710 to 1756. Can you describe this book?
All right, what we've done, this is the second in the series, what we've done is actually written biographies, fairly lengthy biographies, of all the members of the House, the Pennsylvania, what was called the Pennsylvania Assembly in the period. Each volume has a number of legislators who served in that period of time, and at the same time we're also trying to write introductory essays to explain the context of the period, to understand the nature of politics and how the House worked, as well as the people who served in it.
Why 1710 to 1756?
Well, the first volume went from 1682 to 1709, and 1709 was a good breaking point because the 1710 election was one of the first elections, and may have even been the first election, as I recall, where the incumbents were swept out of the House effectively. It was a complete turnover. It was a reaction by Quakers in particular to what had gone for about 4 years before, where no legislation had been enacted. And there had been bitter feelings toward William Penn by some of the earlier assemblies. So in a sense, 1710 was a perfect point to start the second volume. 1756, because it's the beginning of the 7 Years' War, was perfect. And also there's a certain limitation because of the number of legislators. Given the size of the essays, we'd have a 3,000-page book if we went too far beyond 1756. So it was a good breaking point.
Joe Foster, you also contributed to writing this book. You wrote and edited a portion of it. Can you describe the process, how you went about doing this?
Sure. Well, each editor on the project receives their own assignment, each legislator, and we have collected at the project thousands and thousands of documents that we can now refer to immediately to get a background sketch on these individuals. Often we'll go out to the field, we'll go to the repositories in Chester County, Cumberland County, as far as Allegheny County in the future. And we will gather as much biographical information about this individual as possible. We will gather as much political information about this individual, what they did in the House. We'll mine the minutes of the House to sort of get a sense of where they were politically. And once we've collected all this research, we try to write a short but yet fulfilling essay so that we can present to the reader as much information as possible about this individual. Their religious background, were they active in the assembly, were they active in their community, what was their economic status. So we will...
Yeah, part of our dilemma was, in a sense, for us to be able to do this, we really needed to get the approval of our peers, and that was the National Endowment for the Humanities. It was very important to us. And to get through a peer review process, we actually had to do more than the typical biographical dictionary, which were often very small sketches and simply a data paragraph and columns. They would say, how much land did he own? What was his wealth? And he would just plug in a number. And what we wanted to do was something that was much more unique. We wanted to be able to write really interpretive essays that were fairly lengthy, not outrageously long, and also present as well-rounded a view as we could. We weren't just interested in the politics. We wanted to look at their taxes, for example. What was their wealth in the period? How much land did they own? Who were they married to? How large was their family? What were their kinship connections to other legislators? Because often you run into that in any group like this. It's fairly elite, that many of them are actually related, particularly in, say, Chester County, yes, Bucks County, some of the early counties. So we really wanted to present a much broader picture than just politics. And we knew that that would be far more appealing to a body like the National Endowment for the Humanities. We had to demonstrate that it was more than just a little political study of the Pennsylvania legislature in the colonial period. We wanted to show that this was really a unique period. The House was unique, but also we wanted to get a really good picture of who the people were, as well-rounded a view as we could.
I'm sorry, no, sometimes that presents its own problems, though, one of balance. and invariably we'll find warehouses with information about one individual, and then we'll have a legislator who sat for 20 years and will not have left behind a scrap of paper about his life. So one of our objects is we try to mine as much information as possible, and sometimes it is literally like wringing water from a rock. And yet these individuals we know are prominent within their time. They're key leaders within their community and in the House, but we know so little about them. So part of our object is to sort of redress the balance, to give even these individuals enough information so that we can build up a sense of who they were.
Can we set the stage a little bit for this discussion and describe Pennsylvania in 1710? What was it like?
Well, it was still expanding. It was a very early period. When you look at the settled counties in 1710, essentially you're looking at Philadelphia County, Bucks County, and Chester County, and then you have the West and the North, essentially. It was a period when it was still under the proprietorship of William Penn, so you have Quaker domination still of the House at this particular period of time. Philadelphia was growing. It was becoming certainly one of the major ports in the British colonial system. Essentially, the real dilemma, I think, for the Quakers in this period and for Pennsylvania was this whole issue of expansion, because at the same time there was Maryland that they were dealing with, the problems with the border with Maryland, the fact that Delaware was also under control at this time of the Penn family proprietorship. What happens in terms of Delaware? So there's a lot of, New York is competing in terms of the fur trade. So you have a lot of competition in terms of westward expansion. That's going to be a real issue. It's not yet quite as diverse a colony as it will become with the influx of the Germans and the Scots-Irish. That's going to come really in the teens in the 1720s and 30s and beyond. It's still predominantly Quaker with a smattering of Anglicans, some Presbyterians and Baptists, some Swedes and Welsh, some Dutch, although that essentially is coming from the lower counties, what becomes Delaware, because those settlers were there well before the Quakers had been there. So it really is, it's a very interesting period, 1710 and that period, because Pennsylvania can expand dramatically, and yet nothing is certain, particularly when you have a Quaker who's the proprietor and who's not here. That's the other dilemma.
William Penn was still alive in 1710?
Yes. Yes, he was back in England at this point.
What kind of involvement did he have in Pennsylvania?
Well, depends on your point of view. I think from William Penn's point of view, I think he felt that he was very involved in this colony. But he was only here twice. He came over initially and then returned in 1700 briefly before going back to England. For the colonists, however, he was an absentee landlord, and the letters, the exchanges between his counselors and the proprietor often point to the fact that he was absent, that he needed to be here to make decisions as their government falls apart into sort of bickering among themselves as to who was commissioned to do what. So depending on their point of view. Yeah. Part of the problem for Penn also was because he was an absentee landlord, he had difficulty collecting what he thought was his fair share of the quit rents and the various monies that he thought should have been coming to the proprietor, at least to cover the expenses that he had laid out.
The legislature hadn't developed either the way he had wanted initially. He had envisioned a kind of broader, more democratic form in a kind of odd sense. It was going to be both elitist and democratic. Because initially, in 1682, what he had envisioned was a provincial council, which would be like an upper house, of 72 members, and an assembly of 200 members, and of a governor, with the real power, almost complete power, in the hands of the governor and the provincial council. And the House was only to meet for 9 days. And for 8 of those days, they could discuss the legislation presented to them by the provincial council, and then either pass it or reject it. That was to be their sole role. And of course, what had happened is the House had evolved in ways that he had never imagined. So that created a great deal of tension. Also, to be a governor in Pennsylvania at this period of time, you had to be able to take the oaths, which Quakers could not do, the oaths of allegiance, for example, to the crown. So consequently, the governors were not the kind of governors that were really in line with what the Quakers wanted in many cases. So that presented even more tension. And then Penn himself even tried to sell his right to govern the colony at one point. He was so disillusioned with the Quakers in particular and their constant opposition that he felt. to his rule and the rule of the governors.
And broke.
And he was broke. That was the other problem. He was in jail for a brief span of time. Penn himself is a fascinating topic. I worked on the papers of William Penn prior to establishing this project with two of my colleagues, and he's fascinating.
Did he own all the land? He was the owner of all the land in
theory,
Pennsylvania?
yes.
And then if anyone who lived here had to pay him rent?
You purchased, say, 100 acres, and you may have paid 10 to 15 pounds, which was payable over time. But more importantly was the quit rent. That is, even though the land was yours in fee simple, you owed every year like a shilling sterling to the proprietor for the right to have that land. You could own the land and have paid for the land, but if you failed to pay your quit rent, in theory, you could have lost the land, even though you bought it and even though it is yours. Now, the problem was that colonists were slow to pay.
Or didn't at all.
Or didn't at all. So, hence another part of the problem for William Penn.
Yeah, there was a great deal of friction, there's no doubt about it, between them. I mean, the Quakers looked up to him and they admired and respected him, but not as a landlord. And that was one of the major problems. And of course, as the Anglican community grows, they're not sympathetic at all to either Penn or the Quakers. And then, of course, later on with the influx of the Scots-Irish and the Germans, that just further exacerbates the problem to some extent.
To zoom ahead, if I can, in the 1750s, Penn is now dead and his son, Thomas Penn, takes over. And where William Penn was well-meaning and well-intended, but not perhaps very effective in collecting his money, Thomas Penn was never well-meaning, but he certainly was effective. And
Did he live in Pennsylvania?
briefly.
For about 10 years.
About 10 years.
Yes, a rarity for the Penn family,
Yes.
I may add, at that stage.
He came over. He was sort of one of the brothers who inherited the colony, and after they straightened out who in fact was to be in charge, Thomas Penn came over, and all the colonists were quite relieved until he got here, and then they were very relieved when he left. So he came over with the sole purpose, however, of straightening up the finances of the Penn family and getting out what he thought was rightfully his own.
And if you put that next to the fact that this is the time, when he's here in the 30s, I think 32 to 42, somewhere around there, this is the time of the expansion. The colony is expanding. I mean, you have Lancaster counties already developed by that time. And of course, there are all the constant friction along the Susquehanna with Maryland, what's going on up there. You have squatters all over the place on Penn land, because the Penns had also set aside tens of thousands of acres for themselves. They had various manors, they were called. And of course, the Germans and the Scots-Irish weren't concerned about the manors.
Wasn't an issue.
It wasn't an issue. So they're settling left and right on these lands and squatting or getting warrants illegally and things of this sort. So it really created a lot of turmoil.
Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
When were the borders of Pennsylvania established? When was it finally decided where it ended?
Oh my God. Mason,
Where did it end?
When was that decided? How was it decided? The Delaware border, the Maryland border?
now let's see, the Maryland border with the Baltimore family, Lord Baltimore, goes up to the Mason-Dixon period.
That's right.
Mason-Dixon line. Aside from that, I don't know when would be the final determination.
There was something referred to in your book called Cresap's War.
Oh,
yes.
Cresap's War. That was along the
Cresap's War.
Susquehanna. That was Maryland. That
Was
was
a border
the,
war with Maryland?
That was
Yes.
the border war with Maryland, which was quite ugly, actually. There were the ones they were relying on, Penn, were people like Wright, the Wright family, John Wright, later Wright's Ferry, and also Samuel Blunston. They were carrying on the war along the border. They're carrying on the struggle to maintain the border, essentially. They're expanding on the other side of the Susquehanna. And Thomas Penn's major concern is collecting his quit rents, and this was the problem. Blunston would be writing these letters back and forth, please send posses, send weapons, help us out here. We're holding this for you. And he said, well, about the squatters in the area, I think we need to raise the amount of money. I mean, not to put them in a bad light, because literally they hadn't been paid forever. But that was finally settled. There was a compromise in the late 1730s with Maryland, but it was one of these things that just dragged on and on and on. Literally, I'm sure, to the time of the Mason-Dixon line.
Wasn't unique to Pennsylvania. All colonies had this problem, that when the charters were drafted in London in the 17th century, no one had any idea of North America geography, so they just arbitrarily picked lines. the Baltimore family claimed Pennsylvania up to the 40th parallel, which would have cut right through Philadelphia. And I think Pittsburgh too, probably.
Yeah.
So that took decades to contest until it was finally decided in Penn's favor. But Pennsylvania's boundaries, including the northern tier, was not decided until like 1782 in Trenton, at the Decree of Trenton, when Connecticut, of all places, claimed the entire northern tier, that is, the northern Pennsylvania right across to the Mississippi River. And
Did Virginia claim a portion of it at one time?
Virginia claimed what is now Washington County, and but that also was resolved amicably. It didn't. That was not much of a tension point because I think Virginia's perspective was that its claim to that land was tenuous to begin with. They were having difficulty holding it without help, so they were happy to come to terms.
I really do think one of the most astonishing facets. I lived in England for a long period of time and actually worked at the major Quaker library in England. You have a marginalized people in the Quakers in England. And you have William Penn, who's not here except for 4 years, all told. And yet, if you look at the expansion and the size of Pennsylvania, it's extraordinary how they were able to do it. I mean, it really is astonishing. And the fact that the proprietary family, in a sense, didn't even have a great deal of power. Real power resided, and I think that's what comes out in the book to some extent, in the only single-house legislature in the colonies. The way in which the Pennsylvania Assembly expanded its power was really quite extraordinary. And I think that's the thing that is so astonishing, that A, the Penn family proprietary survived to the Revolution, which is, fairly unique, and then beyond that, the extraordinary power of the Pennsylvania Assembly. I mean, it really was unique.
Right. Well, your book is about the Pennsylvania Assembly, so we probably ought to talk about that a little bit. When did it come into existence?
Right away, when they first landed in 1682.
1682.
And Penn laid out his plan, as Craig had outlined, and the colonists promptly said there's just not enough people to go around to fill a 200-person assembly. So he scaled back, but there was an assembly in 1683, and there has been one ever since.
Right. And initially, the problem was, Penn realized that he had to secure the lower counties because it was critical for shipping in the long run. I don't think they ever envisioned, for example, Newcastle to be a rival to Philadelphia or anything of this sort. So what he did is he joined the legislatures. And in effect, there wasn't a legislature for the lower counties. The lower counties, or Delaware, actually they became members of what was the Pennsylvania Assembly initially. So you had this ungodly combination of the Quakers dominating the Pennsylvania area, and then you had, in essence, in some cases, what might later be called almost freebooters down in the lower counties, people who were a wilder brand of people in many cases, those who were much more used to the wilderness, who had come over to an area that was completely unsettled and hadn't fully developed the lower counties. They're suddenly joined in a legislative body with these Quakers who were coming over from England in 1682. And it was an unholy alliance, I think.
The religious meets the a-religious. It just didn't seem to go over well.
At this point, what kind of authority did the legislature have? What was it called? Was it called the Assembly?
It was called the Assembly, Pennsylvania Assembly.
And what kind of authority did they have?
Well, initially their sole authority was to simply approve or disapprove laws. That was the great irony, I think, for Penn is that when he sat down and drafted his Constitution, he was considered a liberal. He was on the cutting edge of liberal thought of 17th century England. He and John Locke, Locke wrote a Constitution for South Carolina. It was the same principle where they tried to incorporate what they thought were all these elements of liberal thought into a government.
What did that mean at the time, liberal?
It meant that the traditional theory was you had a strong executive, that is the monarch. You had a body of individuals who were wise and smart, that is the Senate or the House of Lords. And then you had the commoners, the yeomen, the sort of sturdy, salt-of-the-earth people who, with their common sense, approved or disapproved ideas. That was the traditional political framework, and Penn drew heavily from, for example, James Harrington's Oceana, which came out in the 17th century. It was a political document describing what was the best way to write a government. But it really it ran away from him. Because once you established a government that gave the people a voice, well, then you can't stop them from speaking, and that's exactly what happened. Once the assembly was assembled, they had a lot to say.
Especially if you're not there, and that was the major problem. As an absentee landlord, you're not there, and the time it would take for information to get from point A to point B when you're going across the ocean, and then get the information back, and considering Penn had his own problems in England, that's how a legislative body is able to basically increase its power. I mean, there's no one really to stand in their way to some extent.
So what did they do?
They fought with the governors consistently. The key is money. I mean, in the long run, it's power of the purse. And because the Penn family really was, to put it in a nice way, cheap. They didn't really pay the governors the kind of salary that many of the governors felt was commensurate with the position. So consequently, the real power of the purse very early on lay with the assembly. They paid the governor's salary. If once you're in that position, then you can essentially bargain with a governor, particularly since governors often weren't just living themselves off the money that they had. They also had to pay for whatever government expenditures there were. So that was one facet. They were able to use the legislative process and the power of the purse to gradually gain the right to dismiss themselves, to prorogue themselves or adjourn themselves, complete power over their own membership. Those were very important, because once you can dismiss yourself, and the governor really doesn't have that right, then you're in a much more powerful position. But in the long run, particularly when they developed the General Loan Office, Pennsylvania had a paper currency, like many of the colonies did. And once you develop a General Loan Office and you're able to use the interest that's coming in, the way the General Loan Office worked is the money would be issued and then loaned out as mortgages from the General Loan Office on land, and you would pay it back over 16 years with interest. Well, what happened is the principal gets paid back. That's fine. Where does the interest go? The interest was going into the assembly. So the assembly had this money that essentially they could use that the governor had absolutely no control over. And that becomes a very important weapon to some degree.
That was just Pennsylvania money? Just issued by Pennsylvania?
It was Pennsylvania currency. Many colonies issued their own currency. But Pennsylvania, because it was based on land, was one of the strongest currencies in North America at the time.
Who accepted it?
Well, that's a good question. Philadelphia merchants would accept it. For example, if you were a farmer in Chester County and you wanted to buy a new clock for the hall for your new home, you would head down to Philadelphia and you would order it out of England, and you would pay with Pennsylvania currency. And what the merchant would do was then take that currency and sort of exchange it for London sterling. So you may pay more, in fact, than what it was worth simply for that process. But that's how money was transacted from across the ocean.
But the problem was that Pennsylvania currency made the Crown very nervous. They didn't like colonial money because of its inflationary potential. And if you've contracted debts in sterling and you're trying to pay it off in what is often cheaper currency, I think that's the dilemma. The Crown constantly railed against colonial currency. They often had to write. Pennsylvania laws, when they were passed, had to be submitted to England, and they had the right to repeal them, basically, in England. So one of the major struggles that goes on throughout this period is over paper money. And also, the Penn family was not happy about it, because your quit rents were to be in sterling, and they really did not like to get paid in cheap Pennsylvania money. And yet Pennsylvania had a stronger currency than many of the other colonies. But it's at the Revolution, of course, the currency goes haywire. And then you're looking at, we do a lot of work with land records in these, and you'll see in the early period, if you sell a piece of land for 200 pounds, we consider that quite a lot of money. The Revolutionary period, if you're selling for 20,000 pounds, that's how inflated the currency became. And that's always the danger from the English point of view, that sterling has a value that they felt it's much stronger, it's more consistent. Gold and silver, specie is tangible. Paper, you can just issue willy-nilly. That was their fear.
Right. The members of the legislature, who were they? What type of person would become a member of the assembly?
Invariably, they were people who were at the top of their economic bracket. Typically, they were farmers in the outside Philadelphia area. They would be frequently justices of the peace, county commissioners, people who held local office. They would have, in Chester County, for example, it was a 95% certainty that they were a Quaker.
Quaker. At least
and a good one.
And a good one. In good standing, at least until the French and Indian War.
That's right.
At least until that period. But also they'd be about 42 years old,
That's
be
right.
the general period. They would serve on average maybe 4 to 6 terms. It depends on the area, it really does, because Philadelphia County had never been quite as strongly Quaker. That was one area where there had been quite a few Anglicans that were settled and others. So that was always a little more marginal from the Quaker viewpoint, whereas Bucks County and Chester County were solid. And as you go out, Lancaster County, ironically, has quite a Quaker component in the House. But the further you go out on the frontier, then it begins to change. You get Cumberland County is certainly not Quaker, generally speaking. Northampton County, York County, it's very different, a group of people. But it really depends where you are. Many of them served in local office. And many of them had relatives that may have served in the House. The interesting thing is, on the other side of the coin, is that some people who were extremely wealthy and powerful, who you would have assumed would be in the legislature, never served. And there were also people who were not wealthy and powerful who serve in the House. For example, Bucks County had, I think, what was called a Dutch seat almost.
Yes.
For years on end, they would have somebody from the Dutch community in Bucks County who served in the House, who may or may not have spoken English very well, because you'll find for years, I mean, the Van Horns, for example, I think they may have served 20 terms or so, and never had one assignment in the whole time they're in the House. So, but they represent their community, I think was the idea. And my sense is, to some degree, that in a place like Lancaster County, they tended to be more from the borough of Lancaster rather than the outlying areas, which was a problem that they were trying to rectify. And the other dilemma is, on some occasions, like Cumberland County, William Allen serves for Cumberland County for about 20 terms. He's a Philadelphia merchant.
Right, you were allowed to actually vote for somebody who didn't necessarily reside in your county, but simply owned land in your county. So the advantage, if you're living in Carlisle, of voting for William Allen, who lived in Philadelphia, is that you know he would be there every day.
And you didn't have to pay the expenses to send them down to Philadelphia, which actually entered into it, because the county would pay the expenses for the representative. So it's cheaper.
A term was 2 years. You referred to term.
1 year.
1 year.
1 year term.
I want to ask you about the elections, because you have something in here about the 1926 election riots. Well, the 1926 election, you write here, in Philadelphia.
1726. Oh, I'm sure there were riots in 1926 as well.
1726 election in Philadelphia resulted in a riot in which a mob burned the stocks and pillory, and also the butcher's stalls in the marketplace, and there was also a disturbance in the Chester County election. How did the elections work, and what caused the riots?
Well, the 1726 election riot is pitted for not the first time, but it pitted two specific focal groups in Pennsylvania. Governor Keith, who had just been dismissed as governor, headed up his own faction. And in part, the factions grow out of the Depression of 1720, when the colony was literally thrown for a loop. And so out of their desperation, this is when they begin to pass paper money acts. Keith had sort of a large artisan, indentured servant following. And those people who were mostly hit by the Depression. So in this heated controversy, the pro-Keithites, I guess, for a better term, burned down the stocks and pillars. I hope nobody was in them at the time, but in part it may have been an expression of frustration, simply because the assembly was not listening necessarily to Keith's faction. It had pretty much shut them out of the political process.
And Philadelphia County is intriguing because of the fight for the stairs, because it was at I think it was at Second, or what became Second and Market Street, I think was the. There were market stalls at the bottom, and you would go upstairs, and then, so actually you go up one side of stairs, cast your ballot, which was a ticket that you put in, and then go down the other side. So whoever held the stairs might control the election. So sometimes 1742 was the worst case, where sailors came in on the side of the proprietary faction to stop what they felt were unnaturalized Germans coming down and voting for the Quakers. So consequently, they have tremendous pitched battles sometimes to gain the stairs, so you can control the stairs. The key players in elections are the inspectors. That was the real. Wherever there was reform in elections, it was an attempt to change the way inspectors were actually elected to make it more geographically desirable, so it would be more balanced. They weren't all from one area. And also to make it more objective. Because the real fear, whoever the inspectors were controlled who voted, essentially. And that became the key. And there were also problems in other areas. Philadelphia wasn't alone. Lancaster County was it seems to me, especially in the 60s, was a fairly heated elections.
Pennsylvania was unique in this way, in that it truly was in the cutting edge of democracy, in that even though they had guidelines as to who couldn't vote, many who weren't supposed to did vote. It almost became a sort of common knowledge that your right to vote was always there. The inspectors complained bitterly about people showing up at the polls en masse.
Vote early and vote often.
That's right.
They would put it. But there were a number. Now the House had complete control over the whole issue of elections as well, which was a very important right. So they could determine who could or could not sit. I mean, William Plumstead was a Philadelphia merchant who was elected. I think it was in Northampton County. And there was a very bitter dispute there, and he never was seated, actually. I think it was in 1756. So to some extent, the House needed that right to be able to exercise control over the elections. There would be ballot stuffing in some cases. And the famous case of Susie Wright, who was the daughter of John Wright, up in the upper part of a tavern handing out election tickets from a ladder. I mean, this kind of stuff apparently went on quite a bit.
What kind of a relationship did the Assembly have with England? And the governor was appointed by the king?
No, the governor is appointed by the proprietor with the approval of the crown. So, and normally, as I said, it couldn't be a Quaker. It had to be somebody who took an oath.
Mm-hmm. And then the relationship between the Assembly and England?
They had to submit the laws to the crown within 5 years. And they had ways to get around it. But effectively, the idea is that the common law was supreme, so that the Pennsylvania legislature, in theory, couldn't make laws that were not in line, essentially, with English common law. So laws would be sent to England, at which time they could be approved or disapproved. Now, what the Assembly did was hire agents. They actually had agents. I mean, later on, well, Franklin is an agent. Ben Franklin is an agent for the House. The idea being, obviously, to lobby both the proprietor. Actually, there were three groups they were lobbying. They were lobbying the proprietor. They were lobbying the Meeting for Sufferings, which was the major Quaker meeting in England, feeling that Friends, at least while Friends were controlling the Pennsylvania legislature, Friends in England would help them. For example, on the affirmation question, whether the right to take an affirmation rather than an oath, which was very important to Friends. So they would lobby the Meeting for Sufferings, and the agents would also lobby the Crown. So there were three groups, and it was a real concern. A number of laws were, in fact, set aside by the Crown. It was not an easy relationship between the two.
It was during the era that you cover in this book, 1710 to 1756, that the State House, or Independence Hall, was built. What did you find in your research about the building of that building?
Quite a bit.
Quite a bit. I think it started in 1732, and I think they finished about 1736. And one of the chief architects was a man named John Kinsey, who in fact later serves in the Assembly, was at the time serving at the Assembly, was one of the key Pennsylvania politicians at the time. It took them several years. In fact, after 1736, it took them several years to finish it. And after 36, when the Assembly moved in, they still had not finished the building.
Yeah, the key, the major driving force behind it, originally the House met in private quarters or in any place where they could get a fairly large room. The House being fairly small at the period. You're looking at anywhere from 24 to 36 members, that's all. Andrew Hamilton was certainly a driving force behind it. He had a falling out with John Kearsley, who was the other one that was involved, essentially. And it's believed that the draft for the State House was Andrew Hamilton's. He was the speaker, very controversial speaker for 9 terms of the Pennsylvania House, and a 7-term speaker for what was essentially the Delaware House. And he really became the driving force behind it. And of course, it wasn't just the Assembly that met there. Upstairs was the Provincial Council. So it was easy to run messages that way between. I don't know how they did it early on. They probably were running up the street, basically, to get to the Provincial Council. And then the Supreme Court was also in the same area. And I think the offices for enrolling documents, deeds and things like that, I think were in the same general location. Right. And the land was actually sold by William Allen, who was another very important figure, to Hamilton.
At the time of the Revolution, it takes on even greater significance because the Continental Congress sits, I think, on the 2nd floor or the first floor, I'm not sure now. But they sat on one floor while the Pennsylvania Assembly sat on the other. And by 1775, rolling into 76, Pennsylvania was holding up the revolutionary movement. So in one room, you have Continental Congress sort of steaming away at the Pennsylvania delegates one room over, waiting for them to sort of get on board. And so I imagine the politicking there must have been thick and furious. But
now, you mentioned Benjamin Franklin, and he shows up a couple of places in your book. And I want to read the entry in the alphabetical section under Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, Assembly, City of Philadelphia, and it lists the years 1751 to 1775. And then it says, because the most significant part of the political career of Benjamin Franklin occurred after 1756, his biographical essay will appear in Volume 3. Well, that certainly puts it off, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. We weren't about to take that one on.
No,
we're still figuring out how we're going to do that. It's going to be focused on his legislative career. It has to.
But he was clerk of the House for a
Right.
time.
Yes.
And what was his job there? Was he a member of the House at the time he was clerk of the House?
He just
No.
was the clerk. He simply took the notes, took the minutes. And we know that at one point he must have kept a running dialogue of some of the more important debates. Unfortunately, only a few sheets have survived, which is a real loss to historians, because we could, for once, we have a sense of what they're actually discussing.
Right. And he rarely talks about the House in his letters, which is unfortunate. But as clerk, I imagine he felt a certain confidentiality was necessary. And of course, he was publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette at the time, which is also interesting because they were publishing the minutes of the House at that time.
I want to read the part about that because that's another place that Franklin shows up in this book. It says here, as early as 1704, the Assembly began making its minutes public with a committee appointed to revise the House proceedings for publication, by which the House then meant displaying a handwritten copy signed by the Speaker in the Philadelphia Coffee House at Front and Walnut Street.
Yes.
And people would just come by and see the
The coffee house was a famous gathering point for a lot of the merchants and ship captains that came in, as well as just citizens who lived in the city. And all your important information we posted at the coffee house, newspaper advertisements, pamphlets, including the minutes of the Assembly. And crowds would gather and read the minutes, get a sense of what's happening.
And then it says that, well, that started in 1704. Then it says Andrew Bradford was hired in January 1922 to print the minutes of the House. He was replaced in January 1730 by Benjamin Franklin and Hugh Meredith.
Right.
Yes.
So this was a printing contract that he had,
Right.
that Franklin had
Right.
to do this?
He would have for the minutes of the House. He had a falling out with Meredith, unfortunately, later on, for reasons I don't know if we should go into. Meredith may have had some problems drinking, and that comes up in some of Franklin's letters, and so they had a falling out.
What Franklin did when he came from Boston into Philadelphia, and he was a printer by trade, and he returns from England. He goes to England briefly, comes back. He takes a copy of something that Bradford had done, and of his own volition, reprints it, and does such a great job. He shows it at the Assembly that does a great job that they give him the contract. That he literally elbows Bradford out of the printing business for the Philadelphia Minutes and the laws, and that's how he makes his name. And then by 1745, he was so successful he could literally retire from the printing business and live off the income. As clerk, I just a quick addition. As clerk, we know that he was bored. And then his son, who became clerk after him, was also bored because there's lots of doodles on the minutes and diagrams, and clearly he wasn't paying attention.
They weren't as thorough as we would like. They didn't.
Yes.
One of the problems that we run into in this period, there aren't any division lists. If you look at the Commons, House of Commons in England, you have the division where literally if a question comes up, they divide it and walked out doors, yea or nay. In the House, they very, very rarely, until the Revolution, printed the divisions, which we would love to have had, because it certainly gives us a lot more insights.
Even to
into-
know who voted yes and who voted no. on
yeah.
an issue.
Only on some issues does it really come up. So we were hoping that Franklin would be far more vocal in his letters on what was going on. And occasionally we get lucky with someone who may have kept a diary, like Samuel Folk, I think it was,
Right out of Bucks County.
of Bucks County, who kept a diary of what's going on. So you get a better feel for the dynamics of the House.
For the historian, Franklin's gift is that he leaves Pennsylvania and goes to England. And he was still the titular head of the party, though. And so correspondents wrote to him frequently with giving detailed information about what's happening in the House and politics in Pennsylvania in general. And from those letters, we now get a greater sense of what was happening. We can identify individuals with particular political stances or social movements. But until he leaves and this correspondence is developed, we had no other handle to. I don't want to put that in the wrong light, that he, he did a great job in England.
We have not talked a lot about the specific members of the legislature,
All right.
and I'd like to do a little bit about that. But I want to talk about, get each of you to talk about yourselves a little bit. First of all, Joe Foster, can you tell me where you're from originally?
I'm from Philadelphia. I was born in the city, Temple University Hospital, and I lived in the surrounding area all my life. I received my PhD from Temple University.
In what?
In American history, specifically the American Revolution, and even more specifically, Pennsylvania American Revolution. I did a dissertation on a man named George Bryan, who was a Pennsylvania leader of the revolution in the so-called constitutionalist movement, a very radical element within the revolution. And for years, I've worked on the project. I was on the project from the beginning. 12 years ago, is it? 11 years? Long time.
When you say the project, what do you mean?
The Biographical Dictionary Project. I was
That's
still
ongoing?
It's ongoing, and I was in the process of my PhD when I first came on. And so I'm currently with the project, and I teach adjunct at Temple and at Villanova University.
What are you teaching right now? What classes?
I just finished a course on what I originally started out in my studies was Civil War history. When I first entered the history field, I wanted to be a 19th century historian to do Civil War, but events transpired and I drifted into Revolutionary period. But it was nice to get back, so I just finished a class on Civil War history and Reconstruction, and but I also teach mainly U.S. history courses at Temple University.
And a course on Franklin.
I just,
Taught a course on Franklin.
I just last year I did a seminar on Benjamin Franklin, the writings of Benjamin Franklin, and it was a lot of fun. The students came in and we brought out various letters and texts that he had written, and fortunately Temple was a diverse school, so you get diverse opinions about the various things he had done, and it engendered a great controversy among various aspects of his life, particularly his positions on, well, philanthropy. The public and private persona of Franklin is always a great debate. Was he hypocritical or was he sincere? And personal questions like that.
What did you learn new about Franklin in teaching that course that you hadn't known before?
Gosh, I don't think I fully appreciated just how bright he was. I don't think I had a full sense of the great depth and width of understanding. Franklin really, in his own way, truly understood the 18th century, and he understood Americans. And what he had envisioned and how his thoughts were evolving was he had pretty much laid out where America was going, that it was becoming more vocal, that you couldn't have millions of people sitting in North America being colonialists. It's not going to work. And what he envisioned, in fact, is what has happened, is that an American is going to continue to grow, and they're going to be vocal, and left to their own devices, they will do well. Plus the fact that he had his great knowledge in electricity and virtually every subject he could discuss fluently.
Yeah.
So I don't think I appreciated fully just the great depth of knowledge he had, his capacity to learn.
Now, Craig Horley, how did you get involved in this project?
Well, let's see. The project itself, or the background, Philadelphia.
Well, tell me about your background.
Born, went to Central High School. I had to give a plug to my old high school. Temple University for the BA and the MA in history, English history, and a PhD at the University of Maryland in Tudor Stuart English history, he said. I lived in England for 8 years, teaching for the University of Maryland's overseas program, and also working for the Quakers, the archives. The largest archive for the Quakers is in England, in London. So it was a London Yearly Meeting. Records were there, which are very useful for a book that I was working on the Quakers and English legal system, which I subsequently wrote as a dissertation and published for University of Pennsylvania Press. Came back to Philadelphia and worked on the papers of William Penn, which was a documentary editing project. And then from there, myself and two colleagues realized, A, the importance of the legislature. I mean, we were finding this out indirectly through the papers of William Penn. The other problem was we couldn't identify anyone. We were looking, in the letters itself, our tendency was, of course, to identify either to whom Penn was writing or from whom he was receiving letters, or people mentioned in the letters. And there was very, very little on any of the legislators or their families. And we realized maybe there was a real need for this. So the three of us was Mariana Vokek, who's now at the University of Indiana at Purdue, and Joy Wiltenberg, who's now at Rowan College, and myself basically founded the project and been with it ever since, and hope to continue.
Where does the money come from the project?
Oh, you would ask that question. Well, let's see. The National Endowment for the Humanities has been the major provider of funds. We've been very fortunate. For years, they had what was called reference tools section of the National Endowment for the Humanities, in that this is a reference work. And it's had very favorable reviews on a national level. And the funds, generally speaking, have been matched by the legislature. We've had very good success initially with the legislature in a bipartisan way. The House leadership was very influential in helping us get started out with. At the time, it was Leroy Irvis, who was the Speaker of the House, who was a Democrat, and Matt Ryan, who was the minority leader at that time of the House and is now Speaker of the House.
Who hooked you up with University of Pennsylvania Press?
We approached Temple University Press initially, and they felt it wasn't something that they wanted to take on. And then I had published my book on the Quakers in the English legal system with Penn, and the Penn papers had been published by Penn. And a 2-volume work that I had done on the court records of Sussex County, Delaware, from 1677 to 1710 had been done by Penn. So we had a working relationship, literally. So we approached Penn, and they were very favorable toward it.
What's it like going through the papers of someone like William Penn? I mean, is it excruciatingly tedious, or?
It's funny you would use that phrase. It's tough because you're only dealing with one person. It's much more interesting to do this kind of work where you're dealing with so many different people and so many different records. So in a sense, it can get fairly tiresome. The difficult area for us was actually selecting the letters, because we didn't do all of his correspondence, like, for example, the Franklin papers would do. So we had to actually go through and give a grade to each of the letters in terms of whether we should publish it or not. So the A letters would get published, the B would be debatable. But the other difficulty is, of course, when you have 4 people working as associate editors on a project, and you're just taking a small chronological area, you're not always aware of what was going on before and what's going on after. You're just literally operating in a vacuum. Whereas here, we're dealing with people who may go over 30 years, and we're taking all sorts of different chronological areas when we're doing the House, because we tend to pick our people by geographical location. Maybe Joe will do Chester County and Lancaster County, and I'll work in Cumberland County and Northampton, things of that sort. Other people work on Philadelphia. So there you have a little greater sense of what's going on with everyone else. But a papers project can be difficult in that sense. You really don't get the flow and the continuity. On the other hand, you develop a perspective like Joe did on Franklin, that Penn is extraordinary. He's an extraordinary individual. There's never been a really top-notch biography of Penn. They're still looking for that. That takes in all the facets of the individual. I mean, he really was a fascinating character.
Now, this book has about 1,200 pages and has a list price of $185.
Yes, it does.
Who decided it would be $185, and who's your market?
Not us.
Not us. Shoot the messenger.
We did not. I think the University of Pennsylvania Press decides, and I think from their view, the market are the libraries. It's difficult. I mean, to personalize it from our view, it's hard because we know, for example, that many genealogists, people who may have ancestors who were members of the House or connected to the House in some way, love this book and would like to get it. It's really priced beyond their reach. And our other dilemma is that historical societies, like, say, Cumberland County Historical Society, Lancaster County Historical Society, it's often very difficult for them to be able to match it. But ideally, the market really are the libraries and historical societies and various institutions, because it is, ultimately a reference work.
We should add that we receive nothing from the sales price. I mean,
We get nothing from it.
We don't set the price. We don't receive a dime.
We honestly think it's an outstanding reference work. It's going to be one of its kind for the period. And we really do believe that a place like the legislature needs that kind of institutional memory that was lacking. There's very little was known about the early procedures of the House, how the House worked, the power of the Speaker, and things of this sort that we tend to focus on, as well as who all the various members are.
Now, this book is 1710 to 1756, Volume 2. How's Volume 3 coming along?
Volume 3 is doing well.
When do you expect to be done, Volume 3, and what are its years?
Well, we're not sure yet. We're going to go into the revolution. I think it's going to depend on how many people we run into. What happens in the House is that with the revolution, it mushrooms, it explodes in terms of new people who come in. Because the 1776 Constitution, Joe knows a lot more about it, it's a very radical constitution with term limitations. And consequently, you have not only the expansion, as the colony's expanding with more members, you also have term limitations. So there's an enormous influx of new people that come in. So we're going to take it from 1757 at least into the Revolutionary period. And we should hopefully in about another 2 years?
2 years, I think.
Another 2 years we hope to be finished.
The other dilemma is that the House literally changes its personality after 1756. It operates differently. They have a different set of assumptions. And it's a different set of people, non-Quakers, Presbyterians, Irish, Germans, who just see the world differently.
Yes. Yeah, the Quakers, 10 Quakers resign in 55, 56 because they feel they can't legitimately carry on during a war. You know, friends with pacifist principles. Not all friends.
That was the French and Indian War?
French and Indian War. Not all friends leave. Actually, some remain. And those who leave even weren't happy about it. They were getting a lot of pressure from Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. But for the first time, the House, as a Pennsylvania House, I didn't add in the beginning that Delaware remains connected legislatively with Pennsylvania only until 1704, really. Then Delaware splits off and becomes its own legislature. The same governor controls both Pennsylvania and Delaware. So from 1704 or 1703-4 on, for the first time in the history of the Pennsylvania legislature, the Quakers are no longer the majority with the war. And that does change the dynamics fairly dramatically.
Now, we only have a couple minutes left, and we have
You're kidding.
really not talked about, we have not talked about any of the individuals in here. So I'd like to, first of all, how many different people have biographies in this book?
In Volume 2,
Yeah.
it's over 200.
I think 225, or 323 in the first volume, 225 in this.
Right.
Are they all white males?
All
That
white
is correct.
males.
Even though there is no law that specifically says you had to be white and male, it was just a general understood fact. That was how it operated.
Can you each, with a couple of minutes left, can you each pick out one of your favorites and just tell me a little bit about him?
Usually my favorite is the person I'm working on at the time. That's literally, I just finished, and I'm actually in the process of finishing an essay on John Armstrong, who served out of Cumberland County. And even though he only sits in the House for 3 terms, he becomes a key player for the Western frontiers. He was an Irish Presbyterian. He had become a personal supporter of the proprietary government, but the minute the revolution is declared, he drops his support to the Penn family and picks up the revolutionary cause. He fought in both the French and Indian War. He fought in the American Revolution as a general. He has an interesting career because he brings to the House and to Pennsylvania history a different perspective. It's a perspective of those who live out there on the frontier, sort of up against the hostile Native Americans, although they themselves are equally hostile. But he brings a sort of a sympathetic ear to these squatters and to the landowners who are trying to push into the Indian territories. So in that respect, it was somebody who was different.
How did you find out about him? What did you have to go through to research him?
He is difficult because, like most Irish Presbyterians, we know very little about their early background. The Irish records simply aren't there. But fortunately for John Armstrong, because he was so prominent at the time, there are family histories floating out there, which we read with care, but we are able to sort of get a background information. And once we are pointed into the right direction, then we can begin to dig into those records. Cumberland County records, for example, will tell us where he lived, how much land he owned. The minutes of the provincial council, the minutes of the assembly will tell us his political operations. And the newspapers, after the revolution, begin to give us more detail about individuals. But once we have a background, once I had a background as to where he lived and the primary functions that he performed, I could then begin to suss out more fully his life. Yeah.
Craig Horley, who's your favorite?
It's difficult to say. My favorite in academic terms would be Andrew Hamilton, who, as I said, was probably the architect behind the State House, also 9-term Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, 7-term Speaker of the Delaware Assembly, arrogant, abrasive, very powerful, and disliked rather dramatically. He was a lawyer, one of the few, famous for his defense of John Peter Zenger in New York on a libel case, which is very famous in American legal history. but was so disliked in Philadelphia that although he lived in Philadelphia, he actually ran in Bucks County to get elected, thanks to Thomas Langhorne in Bucks County. But he's a fascinating figure, involved in very bitter disputes, partisan disputes in Philadelphia.
I want to ask you about one of those because you.
Oh, I was going to lean on someone else.
Oh, I'll ask you about him. I just want to read this quote about Andrew Hamilton. You say, he steadfastly refused to disclose his background, his birth and origins, prompting a bitter partisan rival, Sir William Keith, to assert that he was the scabby offspring of a Scotch moggy begot upon his cleanly mother by a scratching peddler against a famous rubbing post in North Britain.
Yeah, that was the nicest thing Keith said about him. Keith was a governor. Keith had been governor who, as Joe had spoken before, that was the election of 1726, who hated Hamilton. Very bitter partisan and rapier wit Keith had. And that comes out in a number of other cases as well. And Hamilton never disclosed his origins. It was always mysterious. It's believed he may have fought a duel, which is why he left Scotland, or he may have been illegitimate. And he never ever actually talked about it. So it's always been a mystery down to the present day.
Who's your other favorite?
James Burnside, who was the first representative of Northampton County, who I thought literally I wouldn't find anything. This is where we run into cases where you think you're not going to find anything. And he was really fascinating because he was in Georgia initially and was actually very much involved with John Wesley. In fact, provided the boat that enabled Wesley to sneak out of Georgia in the dead of night, because at that time Wesley had been indicted. He was had also aroused very bitter partisan recriminations. And Burnside turned out to be one of the more interesting people I did. Became a Moravian and had a falling out with the Moravians. Came back to the Moravians, another falling out. Really very interesting individual. And there was a tremendous amount of information on him. And that I think it was because it was so surprising how much there was. And also the Burnside house still stands.
Do you each work on one person at a time? Are you each working on one particular person right now as we speak?
Yes, it's easier that way. Right now I'm working on or finishing a man named John Douglas, who served from Lancaster County in the 1760s. And we know that he was prominent in this community. We know that he was vocal in his politics. But after 1776, he literally drops off the face of the earth and blends in with the thousands of other John Douglases that live in Pennsylvania. So right now, I'm trying to sort out these various Douglases and see if I can pick up a thread as to whatever happens to him.
Yeah, we don't have a directory that you can go to and says, John Douglas, son of. You sometimes often have to literally work your way through 5 or 6 people of the same name. I have two easy, I usually do 20 people at a time. I'm not the one person at a time. But 2 of the more interesting ones right now are William Allen, who was a leading proprietary force in Pennsylvania, and Daniel Robideau, who was a brigadier general during the Revolution. Very interesting figure.
How many people are working on the project right now?
We have right now 5 full-time, 2 part-time.
Right.
All historians.
This is the cover of the book, Lawmakers and Legislators in Pennsylvania, a Biographical Dictionary. Craig Horley and Joe Foster, thank you very much.
Thank you. We
us,
enjoyed
Brian.
it tremendously. Thanks.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details. Like us on Facebook.